This week on Dialogue, the quarterly report, what if China fails, and the global budget race. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. And once each quarter, we take a look at the latest issue of the Wilson Center's flagship publication, the Wilson Quarterly, with the help of its editor, Steve Lagerfeld. Steve, welcome back.
John, nice to be here.
Here is the current issue.
There it is.
What if China fails? More about that later. We're also joined by two contributors to the current issue. David Lampton is the Dean of Faculty and Director of China Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. In response to the question, what if China fails, he's written a piece titled, We'd Better Hope It Doesn't. Douglas Besharov is a professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and director of the university's Center for International Policy Exchanges. Keeping with our economics theme, he's co-authored the article, The Global Budget Race. And gentlemen, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Steve, tell us a bit about the current issue and about the decision to go with this cover story.
Well, there's a good story behind that, John. I was in a meeting with my fellow program directors here at the Wilson Center, people who run the Asia program and the Latin American program, the nanotechnology program, and so on, 20 or so people. And everybody was waxing very anxious about China's rise, and there was a lot of discussion about various problems that introduced. And then the head of our Asia program, Robert Hathaway, piped up and he said, I won't try to replicate his accent, but he said, well, while all of you people are so worried about China's rise, those of us who study China and study Asia are really worried about its potential for collapse in various ways. And I was sitting there and a little light bulb went off in my head because there's a familiar set of questions here, but that's a very interesting way of looking at this question. And in simplest terms is, if we're so worried about China's rise, should we hope for it to fail? And that's what I asked our authors to look at.
David, your article picks up on that question and essentially echoes the Hathaway notion. What about if it fails?
Well, I think there's the question, what if it fails? And that's not a zero probability, as I try to explain in the piece. I don't think it's the most likely, so it's not arguing China's going to fail. But it is certainly something that wouldn't be in the United States' interest or, I believe, in global interest. Of course, the first thing this raises is, what's failure? How would we know it when we see it? Of course, at the extreme, I suppose we'd all agree there's been a failure. But there are a whole set of problems China could have that would affect the world. And I think most of them would not be good, obviously, for the Chinese people, but they wouldn't be good for China's neighbors, and they wouldn't be good for the global economic system, and they'd almost be catastrophic for the global ecological system. So
do you get
that's the argument.
I'm sorry. Do you get the sense that there are a lot of people rooting against China?
I think people who would really look into, you can understand in the current situation of nearly 10% unemployment, a kind of idle hope that maybe the Chinese stumble and give us a chance to catch our breath, I suppose, might be the way to put it. But I think anyone who seriously looks at the ramifications of anything that one would reasonably call failure, that it would be bad for everyone. I mean, look at a country like Afghanistan with 30 million people. 20 Chinese provinces are bigger than Afghanistan. And look at the problems for the global system that this very remote area has caused. So I think anyone who seriously looks at it couldn't wish for it either in humanitarian terms or the most self-interested terms.
I want to break down some of the ramifications. One is the role of China as the #1 foreign bankroller of the U.S. government. Right. What happens there if China fails?
Well, it'll be bad for everybody, but we should understand that there are lots of Chinese people at this point are wondering why they've loaned the United States so much money denominated in dollars with the dollar falling. In other words, China's leaders are under some degree of public pressure to reduce their investment in U.S. debt. The Chinese are not loaning this money, buying U.S. Treasury securities and agency debt, and indeed loaning municipalities money, corporate paper. I think probably nobody knows exactly how much debt the Chinese have in the United States at all levels and in all forms. But they are not doing this as a favor to the United States. They need a safe, secure, relatively liquid place to put all these dollars they're having to purchase in order to keep their renminbi at a higher, at a lower exchange rate. So they're doing it for their own reasons. I don't think they get a whole lot of leverage over us. I know it's common to say they're our biggest bankroller, therefore we're reluctant as a government to offend them. I don't think they get so much leverage, and in some sense it's like the old saw, you owe the bank $100 and they have you. If you owe them $100 million, you've got the bank.
Yeah, good point. One of the points you make is that a China that's successful is a more responsible global citizen, that more likely to act out if things go south economically. Could you expand on that notion?
Well, of course, that's as much a hope as it is an inevitable fact. But I think the way I would approach it is in the reverse, and that is a floundering China that is failing in the eyes of its own people and its leadership is one that'll be a very much more disruptive power in the world for sure. And the last time we had a sort of a circumstance such as that in China was the era of Mao and the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and the first half of the 1970s. There was a point where China had withdrawn its ambassadors from all countries but one in the world. China had virtually no economic relations. China was supporting insurgencies in Latin America and Africa and so forth. China, since 1978 with Deng, has pursued a much more global, economically involved, the Chinese reform policy we all see before us today. And the record during that period has been joining international regimes, arms control. They've not got a perfect record now, but much better. China has peacekeepers working with the UN around the world, including in Africa, in Haiti. China in the World Bank and the IMF, by almost everybody's account, has been a pretty good citizen of those organizations. So the record's not perfect, and I'm not arguing to say saying there's an inevitable, as China gets more wealthy and modernized, it inevitably could be a good citizen. But I feel reasonably confident that if it's floundering, it'll be a really bad citizen.
Well, this is sort of unfair since I asked you to write about what if it fails. But let's turn it around. If we don't want it to fail, how much should we want it to succeed, and along, what dimensions? There are different kinds of success. I mean, there's economic success, there's political success. We have a communist regime. Right. It ensures a certain degree of stability, but over time there's a question whether we should be in favor of that, or continuing fantastic economic success.
Right. Well, first of all, I'd like to address this communist issue just for a second here. Certainly it's an authoritarian government. Certainly it's a Leninist, highly organized, disciplined, one-party, non-competitive state. So it's all of those things. But as an ideological state, seeking the workers' paradise and equality and elimination of capitalism, in those terms, I haven't met a communist in 15 years, at least, in China. I'm sure there are some, but I haven't met them, and they're not making policy. But to get to your question on what dimension should we hope they succeed, or conversely, maybe don't make such progress. I think economically we have actually a quite large interest in China continuing to build its middle class, both because as they move up that consumption scale, they're going to be buying the kinds of things we make. That's the first thing. Of course, it implies we keep moving up the value-added scale and keep ahead of them. Just to give you a figure, U.S. exports to the world in 2009 dropped 20%. Our exports to China dropped 0.2%, which is to say not at all. So it's the largest, most rapidly growing, or the largest economy most rapidly growing for our exports. And so we have, if President Obama is going to meet his goal of doubling exports in 5 years, I would just say on the face of it, impossible unless we continue to make progress in exports to China. Now, we got lots of problems there. I would say politically we actually have an interest, because I think in the long run a growing middle class is the soil in which more democratic or pluralist governance occurs. So if you wish China ill economically, I think you're inadvertently, I don't mean you, but one, is in fact diminishing the progress towards humanitarian government, as slow as it admittedly has been.
We're going to come back to China, so you can't leave the stand. You're still under oath. But I want to shift gears and talk about Doug's piece a bit. Doug, early on you write, whether they know it or not, the developed and emerging nations of the world are in a race. What is the race they're in? Define the race.
Well, they are all long-term broke because their social welfare systems were built on the supposition that workers would support retired people. And we are just running out of workers. In fact, even in China, the old saw or the new saw is they're worried that they'll become old before they become rich. But I think it's now 7 to 1 workers in China, and I think it's slated to go down in the next 50 years to 2 or 3 to 1.
Right, exactly.
And that just doesn't get you enough of the transfer that you need of income, and that means that most developed or developing countries have to figure out a different way to provide social welfare services. Just to keep up with China for a second, I think they call it the 3 mountains. When I was there, that's the way they described it. Why the Chinese don't save. I mean, why they do save, excuse me, which is they have to pay for their own health care, they have to pay for their own education, and they have to pay for their own retirement. We're on the other side of the boat in the U.S. and in Western Europe. We guarantee some version of health care, some version of education, some version of retirement, so our people don't save enough. So the global budget race is, in the developing countries, in the West especially, somehow to get our people to save more, to make the burden of the social welfare system in the future less. And I think the race in Asia, especially in China, is higher consumption for their own internal purposes, and also providing a long-term safety net for their people. It's easy to get that wrong. Get it wrong, you're less productive. Get it wrong, you don't compete in the international marketplace. And we've seen examples over the centuries of nations that were wealthy but chose the wrong policies and became less wealthy over time. That's why I called it a race. You don't have to get it right. You just have to get it better than the other guys. Yeah. You know, there's that old story, if you and your friend are walking in the forest and a bear comes upon you, how fast do you have to run? Just faster than your friend.
Wouldn't you say, just on this, though, that in a way the Chinese have the easier political problem, which is to convince their population, in a sense, to spend more? We've got a more, it seems to me, difficult problem, because we got to convince our population to spend less in some sense, in a consumption sense.
Sure, I think that's right. And we both have a giant technical problem of how to structure these programs. The one thing about the Chinese, they seem to study everyone. And they know, I think they know pretty well the mistakes we've made. I don't think they yet have an idea of, you know, how to structure their systems to avoid our problems with Medicare, our problems with Social Security. And my guess is they may do better to look at Singapore, right?
Doug, I'm trying to get a sense of, you know, how desperate the situation is. One of your other lines, the accruing national debts are truly staggering. Is this race a sprint? Is economic collapse imminent?
Well, as we tape this show, the Brits have just announced 25% cuts in many, not all their domestic programs. They've protected national health insurance and so forth. They think they've got to get running right now. Many of the European countries feel that as well. We, at least for now, lead a somewhat charmed life, and the pairing of the Chinese story and the budget story is really quite interesting here. It's not just the Chinese. There are people all around the world that keep investing in American dollars, even as the dollar goes down in value. because in part, where else are they going to put it?
Right.
So we have not had to rush to do what the Brits are doing today, what the French are doing, what the Germans are doing. But what they say on Wall Street is 2 failed federal auctions of federal debt, and the Congress will get the lesson that we have to make our cuts, and very quickly. That's why I think the wise choice is to be ready now for the cuts that I think are inevitable, as well as the tax increases, by the way.
Yeah, one of your conclusions is there's no solution that doesn't involve big spending cuts and big tax increases.
That's right. The argument is how much of each. There, as David was saying, our political situation is much more complicated than in other countries. Parliamentary countries, which are sometimes called temporary dictatorships, the government can make a decision and it may fall, but until it falls, it has imposed these rules. We are a much more diverse, we are a continental country, we are a federal system, well, we're a federal, state, and local system. That means our problems are more multidimensional, there are more players, and there are more vested interests that make it difficult for us to take decisive action.
If cutting spending and increasing revenue are inevitable, is a drop in standard of living similarly inevitable? And I know we'll talk about China, which is a different story. They're trying to elevate standard of living, create a middle class. Is a standard of living decline in America almost inevitable?
Yes and no. The direct answer is yes, but that depends on how essential you think a new SUV every 2 years is.
Defining standard of living.
Yeah, you know, we live on borrowed money. That's why we live a richer life than what we produce or earn. On the other hand, we are an exceedingly rich country. Both our human capital, our natural resources, and our demographics will stand us in very good stead for the next 100 years if we just get our policies right.
Mm-hmm. And China in a much different boat as far as this goes. Want people to spend more.
Right, and as Doug was saying, they're looking. They've gone from the plan, cradle to grave kind of conception under Mao, very rapidly to the market, and they didn't have the kind of resources to capitalize a lot of government promises, and so everybody is saving like crazy to meet their life needs. I would add, I think, housing on this list. You got housing, education, retirement, and medical to some extent, particularly in the rural areas. China has a problem, though, that we're not talking about in the U.S., because we're at least talking about an almost universally urban society. China's still 55% rural, although we have to have a little discussion what rural means.
Is the momentum toward urbanization?
Sure, and it's moving very rapidly. They've already, just in the last 30 years, urbanized 300 million people, a population the size of the U.S. They still have 400 million to go, and this is one of the problems. How do you build that urban infrastructure, build that social safety net? You know, just moving from the rural areas to the urban areas, you double per capita power consumption, just for example. So the amount of infrastructure they have to build, and yet they still going to, for the next 30 years, have a significant sized rural population. So how do you deliver health care and income maintenance and so on in the rural areas? And they're trying to do that from a current per capita GDP of $6,600, whereas we're at 45,000+. So as I tell my students, you don't want to be a Chinese leader.
You know, not to throw a lot of numbers around here, but when we talk about the savings question and consumption question, which is really at the heart of a lot of this, we're talking about Americans who now save, I think, 6 to 7% of their income, and Chinese who save 60 or 70% of their income, if I understand that correctly. So there is sort of a big difference.
Yeah.
Those people are not going to start spending money on American exports or any number of other things until they deal with the three mountains. Until there's a retirement system of some kind, until there's a more organized healthcare system and so on. Where are they with that? Is there any?
Well, you're right. Of course, the bulk of the Chinese people are still into the high savings mode, but even a small percentage of 1.3 billion people is a lot of people, and so you've got enormous numbers of millionaires, 100 millionaires, and quite a few billionaires in China at this point. And so that subset is very high. China's the most rapidly growing society for the growing import of luxury goods in the world. And so you have that going on at the same time. You've got this rural population and then this much more modestly income. But this creates the equality problem in China. And how does the elite create a sense of social justice with such wide gaps in income? And China's now in the status of among the most widely unequal income distribution. So exports of luxury goods going up. At the same time, you have people worrying about their very basic needs, both current and towards aging problem.
And when you talk about these social safety nets or retirement or health care, Social Security and Medicare is what we call it here often. And here's a great contextual sentence in your piece, Doug. The cuts Secretary of Defense Robert Gates proposed in August though controversial, I should say, came to only $100 billion over 5 years, or about a week of each year's Social Security and Medicare expenditures. 1 week. By comparison. So that's where the money is.
That's right. We picture this behemoth of Pentagon spending, and we are the largest by far military power in the world, and we spend a great deal of money. But we are such a large, such a rich country that's almost peanuts compared to the rest of what we spend in our budget. So the cuts will have to be in Social Security and Medicare. There'll be cuts on the military side, which, by the way, are going to have all sorts of other strategic implications, not the least of which is how much we pay for oil.
Tom Friedman keeps writing these pieces where he is almost envious of China where it comes to green technologies or whatever, but then always apologizes for saying, well, I'm not supporting this authoritarian command and control model. I know we're different. But along these lines, you talk about the need for this, I think you call it a grand social welfare compromise. Given the current political climate, is that a realistic hope?
I think it's even more realistic than before.
How so?
When the Democrats, first of all, when the Republicans were in the ascendancy, or when the Democrats were completely in the ascendancy, their ability to compromise with the other side is sharply reduced. I think it was a mistake, but I can understand it. The Obama administration went for the last Democratic vote in the House and the Senate for his budget, as opposed to the next 5 Republican votes. And there's loads of reasons for that. So that's not a criticism. That's just what happened. If there is this influx of Republicans, even if they don't control either house, they'll need to compromise. They'll have to bring people in, and what that means is the Republicans, who are not going to sign off to any tax increases without sharp budget cuts, will enable, I think, and the word is enable, the Democrats and Obama to make the cuts that are needed.
So the theory is, as the margins decline, bipartisanship increases, or at least the possibilities of bipartisanship?
Well, or the requirements of bipartisanship. Politicians like to make deals.
Gives me a great segue into something I want to ask Steve about that changes the subject, and that is every issue has an editor's comment, and in this one it's called Farewell, Sir. And you're talking about the departure of our beloved leader, Lee Hamilton. And here's one of the things Steve writes: a living symbol of bipartisanship in a city where that quality is exceedingly rare, he has shown that being in the middle is not a matter of being wishy-washy. Talk a bit about your piece on Lee.
Well, first, it's a very heartfelt piece. Lee is leaving after 12 years of exceptional leadership of the center and an exceptional public life as vice chairman of the 9/11 Commission and a number of other things, and he's been a great public citizen. But I think to all of us personally, he's also been just a great example as a leader and as a person who is perfectly suited to this institution in his possessing very strong views of his own, which I've heard, but also a real willingness to listen to the other side. He doesn't think that he has a monopoly on truth. And many, many, many of us do think we have a monopoly on truth, or at least that the other side, has no shred of the truth. And Lee is cut from a totally different cloth. I think that's one of the things that makes him so precious, and that's made him such a great leader for the Wilson Center, which is exactly devoted to the idea that that we need to hear from all sides, or as we say at the Wilson Quarterly, both sides. There's usually more than two, though.
Right, multiple sides. Here's another thing you write. Lee explained that one of the biggest divides among politicians is simply between those who are willing to listen to others and those who are not. Exactly what you talked about there, which is a great example of learning to listen.
One of the great things about Lee is he really did listen. We have a cafeteria here where we all have lunch. It's actually just outside this door. And Lee will come in on many a day and just sort of sit down, and he has a little group of guys, women and guys he usually sits with, and sometimes he'll sit down with a bunch of interns or some visiting scholars and so on and so forth. All of us have had some great conversations as a result of that.
Yeah, great job benefit, educational.
That's one of the great fringe benefits. And so one day I put the question to him, how do you explain the success of certain politicians, and what separates politicians one from the other? And that's one of the answers that he gave me.
Well, before we sign off, about a minute left, give us a preview. What are you working on for the next issue?
Well, it's unfair to ask an editor what is in his last issue and what's coming in the next.
But I do it every time.
We are working right now on some very good pieces on crime and punishment. We're at a sort of turning point in our society where we've had a growing and growing prison population, declining crime. There's signs that the prison population is turning down, and partly because we can't afford to keep so many people in jail anymore, and we need to find some other ways of dealing with these problems. And so we'll be looking at some of the latest research and findings there, and some very interesting stuff. You
mentioned that in your piece about the cost of prison. Gentlemen, thank you. Terrific pieces.
Thank you.
And a pleasure to speak to you about them in person. And Steve, thanks again for joining us as always.
For having us, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.